Hello, my name is Hannah Burns, and our group looked at the effects of mindfulness on prosociality, altruism, and empathy. For our hypotheses, we said that we predict that people who listen to a 10-minute mindfulness audio will indicate greater state mindfulness. We also predicted that people who are in the mindfulness condition will indicate greater prosociality, altruism, and empathy on a self-report than people who listen to a 10-minute control audio. Or previous research indicated that mindfulness has the potential to increase prosocial responses toward ostracized strangers using empathy. And this was the Berry All study. Additionally, there was a cross-sectional study on the relationship between mindfulness and empathy that indicated future research should address stress and how someone's stress level could impact their levels of mindfulness and empathy. And this study showed that mindfulness did increase levels of empathy over time. And finally, we have studies that examined the roles of prosocial behaviors as a direct result of audio recordings. And these studies support that mindfulness can cultivate intrinsic motivations, increase willingness to help others, and finally increase empathy towards others. For our method, our participants consisted of 100 participants, several of which were omitted for not completing our study. In total, there were 69 females and 16 males, and our other participants either chose not to answer, and I believe 2 of our participants were transgender. Of the people who got to our manipulation, there were 10 in the mindfulness manipulation audio and 17 in the control condition audio. All of our participants had to be at least 18 years of age, and our participants were recruited via a link posted on social media, and the social media we used were Reddit, Snapchat, Instagram, and Facebook. For our materials, we had 2 different conditions, and our participants were separated into either a mindfulness body scan condition or a control condition. And both conditions listened to a 10-minute audio tape. We had the MAAS scale, which was the Mindfulness Attention Awareness Scale, measuring both trait mindfulness and state mindfulness. Then we have the PBS, which stands for Prosocial Behavior Scale, and this was a self-report of an individual's overall prosociality. Our AASRS was the Altruism Adapted Self-Report Scale, and again, this was measuring altruistic behaviors. And finally, we have the TEQ, which is the Toronto Empathy Questionnaire, which again was a self-report measuring one's own empathy. For our procedure, we did the following in chronological order. Our participants read and signed the informed consent. They completed the demographics questionnaire, and then the trait MAAS, followed by either the mindfulness or the condition audio manipulation. And then they completed the state MAAS, the PBS, the AASRS, and finally the TEQ. For our results, we separated them into sex and then condition. So first we'll talk about results by sex. We used independent samples t-test for all of our data. First, we have trait mindfulness that we looked at before our participants completed listening to the audio. And the t-test suggested that there was not a significant difference between conditions for trait mindfulness before completing the audio. After the audio, we looked at prosociality, and there was a significant difference between the sexes in that females had a significantly higher score of prosociality with a mean of 47.79 and a standard deviation of 5.83, whereas males had a mean of 40.25 and a standard deviation of 8.42. Next, for altruism, there was not a significant difference between males and females. Females had a mean of 47.39 and a standard deviation of 8.61, whereas males had a mean of 48.0 and a standard deviation of 9.20. And finally, for empathy, again, there was not a significant difference between males and females. Females had a mean of 46.89 with a standard deviation of 2.62, and males had a mean of 45.5 and a standard deviation of 1.91. And we used a significance level of 0.05. Next, we have a visual representation of our results by sex. On the left, we have a graph that compares the overall scores of each of our independent variables, which are state mindfulness, prosociality, altruism, and empathy. And this is looking at all of those overall scores compared by sex. Blue is the males and orange are females. These scores are relatively close together overall, with the exception of prosociality, again, in which females scored significantly higher than males. And on our right, we have table 1, which represents the data from our t-tests that compare each of our independent variables based on sex. Next, we had our results by condition. So they had either, again, the mindfulness body scan audio or our control audio. And we used independent samples t-tests for all of these. Again, for prosociality, the mindfulness group had a mean of 47.22 with a standard deviation of 6.70. And the control group had a mean of 46.13 and a standard deviation of 6.80. And our results were not significant for prosociality. As for altruism, the mindfulness group had a mean of 48.89 with a standard deviation of 6.62. And our control group had a mean of 46.57 with a standard deviation of 9.35. And again, our results were not significant between mindfulness and control. And finally, for empathy, our mindfulness group had a mean of 47.67 and a standard deviation of 3.08, whereas our control group had a mean of 46.0 and a standard deviation of 1.78. And yet again, our results were not significant enough to support our hypothesis. And this is another visual representation of our results by condition this time. On the left, we have a graph that shows the comparison of overall scores for each of our independent variables again, where the orange is the mindfulness condition and the yellow is the control condition. The trend seen here suggests that the manipulation has a slightly positive relationship with the scores compared to the control group. And on our right, we have table 2, which shows data from our t-tests that compares each of our independent variables according to the condition the participants were in. As for our discussion, overall, our hypotheses were not supported. Our original hypotheses were that the primary role of prosocial behaviors were the result of an audio recording, and this demonstrates that mindfulness can cultivate intrinsic motivations, increase willingness to help others, and increase empathy toward others. However, there was a significant difference between men and women in regards to prosociality, in which females had higher prosociality compared to men after the audio manipulation. And our hypothesis was close to being supported in that our results showed positive trends from the mindfulness condition, increasing each of our independent variable scores overall compared to our control audio. This suggests that a brief mindfulness meditation does not positively affect participants' level of state mindfulness, altruism, and empathy, but with a larger population, it's likely that our hypotheses would be supported. Some implications of our current results are that, again, a larger sample size would likely prove or not prove support our hypothesis. And the results show that there's likely an improved interpersonal relationship skills for an individual following mindfulness manipulations, and that mindfulness was suggesting, our trends were suggesting that there's an increase in prosociality, empathy, and altruism for an individual following mindfulness meditations. So this is likely to improve different interpersonal relationships for an individual. Some limitations of our current research, again, were our sample size. And our sample size went down to 22 out of 100 due to most of our participants not finishing our survey correctly or at all. And it's likely that most of these participants dropped out due to the length of our survey. Because our audio was 10 minutes long, that made the rest of our study significantly longer because we had so many scales used in our research. The average time a participant spent on our study that completed our study was 25 minutes. And because, again, it takes so long to complete our study, it's likely why most of our participants dropped out. Because we only had a few weeks to collect data. That also is a limitation on our current research, as if we had more time to collect data, we also would likely have more participants. For future research, we suggest that researchers should collect more participants, likely leading to a longer time of data collection. We suggest that future researchers should look into the positive effects of mindfulness on romantic relationships, because we implied that from our research, general interpersonal relationships would be improved based on mindfulness manipulations or mindfulness meditations. So we think it would be interesting to look at how specifically romantic relationships would be affected by mindfulness meditation. And we suggest also looking at other variables such as stress, as mentioned in one of the previous studies that we used when forming our study. It would be interesting to see how an overall level of stress before an audio meditation would be affecting the results of overall levels of each of our independent variables based on the amount of stress one holds before listening to an audio manipulation. And finally, we suggest looking at different dimensions of each of our independent variables we used. So that would be looking at different types of empathy as well as altruism, and seeing how an individual may vary in their overall scores for each of those measurements used in our study, if we looked specifically at different dimensions of each of those. Thank you.